Lucas, eBreeze President and CEO, and I'm delighted to moderate today's webinar, which is actually a reprise of a session we did in January's American Savings Education Council Winter Symposium. During last month's half-day meeting in Washington, we asked, how are women likely to fare in retirement? What unique challenges do they face? And how can they get on the right path? The discussion generated so much interest that we wanted to bring key findings to a broader audience through this webinar. Certainly theories abound as to why women fall behind men when it comes to saving for retirement. I've heard it framed as psychological. Perhaps the topic is more intimidating and unappealing to women than men. Another theory is that the financial industry is male-oriented and women may not feel included and therefore don't participate in financial planning as much. And there are some who believe the barriers women face are mostly, if not all, circumstantial. It is harder for women to get to a financially secure retirement because they live longer, they earn less, they have more career interruptions, and when they do live longer, they're probably going to live alone and require more serious medical care than men. So clearly lots of food for discussion. Today we'll hear from Jack Vander Hai, eBreeze Director of Research, whose newest issue brief shows the retirement shortfall differentials for women versus men, specifically those who do end up alone, either because they are single or widowed in retirement. We'll also hear from Anna Rappaport, who will discuss survey findings and focus group research that gets at the different retirement routes that women navigate relative to men. And of course, we'll leave plenty of time for questions. To ask a question, just right-click on the Ask Questions link in the upper right corner of your screen to open a chat window that will appear in the bottom left corner. Your questions will be answered at the end of the session. So now let's get started with research from Jack Vander Hai.
Situation for widows, widowers, single males, or single females. It's basically the entire concept of longevity risk is going to be ignored by those models. And as Anna is going to point out in her presentation in a few minutes, one needs to be cognizant of this risk when analyzing the retirement income adequacy prospects of women, whether they're single, females, or widows. So the model that I want to go through very quickly is the eBreeze Retirement Security Projection Model. It's something that basically we started developing in the late 90s. We were working with the governors of Oregon, Kansas, and Massachusetts because they were very paranoid that they, in essence, had no idea what was going to happen with future generations of retirees. And, of course, if those retirees became financially indigent, then the states would be on the hook for things like nursing home costs because of Medicaid. So we started doing this on a state-by-state basis. We ended up putting together a national retirement income adequacy model that we've been using since 2003. And very quickly, we've got two phases in this. We've got an accumulation phase, which is basically going to simulate retirement income or wealth for households currently ages 35 to 64. We try not to go younger than that because it's so difficult if you look at a 25-year-old and their salary to try to figure out their age-wage profiles. So we basically try and stick with people between 35 and 64. We combine all the information from defined contribution plans, defined benefit plans, IRAs, whether it's rollover, regular Roth, etc., Social Security, and net housing equity. We have the defined benefit information from a time series of several hundred plans, so we're basically able to account for the swing, for example, from final average to cash balance plans and even the frozen plans. When it comes to the 401k side, we have asset allocation contribution behavior based on individual administrative records. This is not survey information. We have annual linked records going back to 1996. And currently, in conjunction with ICI, we have more than 27 million employees in over 110,000 plans, which gives us a very good advantage when it comes to trying to do the behavioral economics behind this. We also have 25 million IRA accounts owned by 20 million unique individuals, so we can also bring that into the overall accumulation phase. Once we get people to retirement age, and we typically baseline this at 65, but we can certainly use other ages, We simulate for each household 1,000 alternative life paths, and we do this in two ways. We split basically all the retirement costs into deterministic costs, things that are relatively easy to predict if you know what's the age, the wage, the family status, basically whether they have a house, whether they have a mortgage. So things like food, apparel, service, transportation, those are done on a deterministic standpoint. But to get into the things like longevity risk that are going to matter today, as well as investment risk and long-term care risk, we do a separate stochastic model for that and basically add the two together. Bottom line is it produces two different output metrics. The first one is our retirement readiness rating, which is just simply the percentage of simulated life paths that do not run short of money in retirement, so you can think of that as a probability of having a successful retirement. But the one problem with that, of course, is if somebody runs short of money, it's going to matter a great deal whether they run short by a couple hundred or several $1,000s or several $100,000. So basically we also have a retirement savings shortfall, which is what we're going to be focusing on today, which is the present value of deficits for those who run short of money in retirement. So next slide, David. And the modifications on what we're going to do specifically for today is we've been asked a lot to look more specifically at the retirement income adequacy for widows. Prior to this time, we had always done single males, single females, and then we combined married together regardless of which spouse died first in retirement. So what we're going to basically break this up to now is looking at single males, single females, married where the husband dies first, and married where the wife dies first. I should just point out very quickly that these are all determined at the time of retirement. So you're going to have single females who perhaps were married prior to retirement, but either because of post-retirement survivorship or because of divorce, they're now in a single status. So the first slide with a chart on, next one, David, basically gives the average retirement deficits. This is retirement savings shortfall by marital status and gender. And again, this is for what we're going to focus on right now is for the Gen Xers specifically. And you'll see why in a couple of minutes, because we want to focus on basically how many future years of eligibility they would have for things like defined contribution plans. But if you look at the four categories that I mentioned, the one on the left, the widowers, we find on average they're going to be about $18,000 short. That's how much more money on average a widower would have needed at 65 to prevent having a shortfall in retirement. A widow is just slightly more at 22 grand. As you'll see, the single females, though, are the situation, obviously, that's most dire. They are on average short by about 72,000. And then if you look at single males, it's 37,000. Now, the one problem with this particular chart is it's looking at averages that include both those people who have retirement shortfalls as well as those who don't. So if you look at the next slide, it's basically exactly the same thing, but now this is a conditional retirement deficit. We only look at what the average amounts are for individuals who do run short. And now you see basically a lot of the gender differences subside. The difference between 82 and 76 for widows and widowers is relatively small. But where you really see the big difference is between single females and single males. At 131 versus 128, delta or differential is very, very small compared to the differences on the previous page. And again, where this is all coming from is there's a much higher probability of running short in retirement if you're single female as opposed to single male. But if you do run short, then basically it looks to be, from a conditional severity standpoint, pretty much the same kind of exposure. On slide 9, what I want to do very quickly is start breaking this out first by wage quartiles and then by years of future eligibility. If you take a look at the same four categories we've been looking at in the last couple of slides, if you look at that grid on the bottom, I'm going to basically focus on the second and third rows, these are your widows and your single females. And if you look at the left-hand side, for those with the lowest pre-retirement wage quartiles, again, these are averages, so they include the zeros, they're not just the conditionals. You see that there's about an $86,000 average for the widows with the lowest pre-retirement wage quartiles. But follow that row all the way to the right side where you get to the highest quartile, and you see that 86,000 falls all the way to 11,000. Looking at the row right below it, you see that single females in the lowest wage quartile have an average retirement deficit of about 110,000, but if you go to the highest wage quartile, that's going to drop all the way to 28,000. Now, the problem with this page, of course, is although it does a nice job of summarizing the overall differentials, they're only the means, and the means obviously tell only a part of the story. There is a huge appendix in the back of this, and is also in the issue brief that I'm not going to have time to go through, that looks at all of this in terms of deciles. But let me just go to the next slide, slide 10, and what I did is just picked an arbitrary number, $100,000. So what we're saying here is what percentage, broken out by wage quartile and by the various gender categories that we've already talked about, what percentage of them are going to have a retirement deficit greater than $100,000? So again, focus on those second and third rows, the widows and the single females. Lowest quartile, the one on the left, 42% of the widows basically are going to have a deficit of at least $100,000. 48% of the single females, almost 50%. But again, follow that all the way to the right-hand side where you look at the highest wage quartiles, and you see how much they drop down to only 4% for the widows having at least $100,000 in a retirement deficit, and 13% for the single females. Slide 11 then, David, looks at basically the same categories as before, but instead of breaking it out by wage quartiles, I'm looking at your future, underlying future years of defined contribution eligibility. Obviously, wherever you are today, you're not going to be able to change how many years you've already had, so this is only looking forward-looking as far as eligibility. And the other important point to make is this is not participation. This is much more about coverage, about having the opportunity to participate, whether or not you participate. So again, let me look at the second and third rows for you. We're going to look at the widows, the single females. Those widows who have no future years of eligibility, so any year they work with an employer from now until the time they hit 65 is not going to be with an employer who offers them participation defined contribution plan. They have on average a deficit of about $31,000. But if you go all the way over to the right side and see those who are fortunate enough to basically work for an employer for 21 to 30 years with future years of eligibility, we can reduce that $31,000 down all the way to $7,000. Likewise for the single females, for the row right below it, you see a $97,000 deficit for those without any future years of eligibility, and that can go down to $24,000 if they're fortunate enough to basically be eligible for all their future years of work. So slide 9, excuse me, slide 12, does exactly the same thing as before, where we're going to try and now look at more than just the means. So I'm going to have that same ad hoc value of $100,000 and see what percentage of people by these various categories are going to have a deficit of more than that. Again, the second and third rows, if you look at the widows in row 2, those that have no future years of eligibility, we have a 13% probability that you're going to be over $100,000 on the deficit. Going all the way over to the right side, those that are fortunate enough to have 21 to 30 years of future eligibility, that drops all the way down to only a 3% probability that the deficits will be over $100,000. Likewise, with single females, the row right below it, you have a 42% probability of having at least $100,000 deficit if you have no years of future eligibility, and that drops all the way down to 11% if you have 21 to 30 years. So then moving on to the last topic, excuse me, on slide 13, what are the next steps in terms of the EBRI research agenda with respect to this? And A lot of what we've been doing with this model in recent years, although we have done a fair amount looking at plan design and the differences between, let's say, voluntary enrollment and automatic enrollment with auto escalation. But in terms of public policy designs, we've been basically trying to analyze recently, first of all, Representative Neal's 2017 proposed Automatic Retirement Plan Act. We have references in the back, so if you want to take a look at something I put out in May of 2018, we see just how much, in essence, ARPA 1 would reduce deficits and by how much and for which age cohorts. But in addition to that, we've also been looking a lot lately at auto portability. And very quickly, what we mean by auto portability is a situation where there'll be some type of clearinghouse where when people basically leave their jobs prior to retirement, the account balances will basically be transferred over to these clearinghouses, and then presumably once the employee ends up with a new employer, one that offers a retirement plan, then basically those old balances can be added in with the new balances, and in essence you are going a long way to trying to eliminate one of the biggest problems we find with respect to retirement income adequacy on the DC system, and that of course is cash outs. So we took a look in our July 2018 publication, just basically what auto portability would do in terms of overall retirement deficits. And then we also, in September 2018, looked at what auto portability would do if it was added to ARPA 1 in essence. We're currently working through the modifications to the Automatic Retirement Plan Act as introduced, as suggested by Representative Neal, and hopefully we'll have something on that fairly soon. So what I want to end up with on this next slide is to show the impact of auto portability by itself, where this is not ARPA yet, in terms of its impact on retirement deficits for the same four groups. All I'm showing you here are the percentage reductions. So if you want to figure out, in essence, how much this means in dollars, you just go back and apply these percentages to the dollar figures you saw on the previous slides. But what this shows is, as a function of future years of defined contribution eligibility, how much introduction of a pure auto portability...
Excuse me? Could you possibly speak up? I can't hear you.
Is anybody
Speak
else
up a
having
little?
problems?
It's better, yeah.
Right, I'm right in the microphone. Okay. So basically trying to show what the overall impact is going to be from the introduction of a pure auto portability system. Let me just, for the sake of time, go all the way over to the right-hand side. As you would expect, those who are basically having more years of future eligibility would tend to benefit most from this. We find that for the widows, the second category, that their overall retirement deficits would be decreased by 31% if we had a pure auto portability system and basically could more or less eliminate those cash outs. The single females, again, they're not going to benefit quite as much because they tend to have lower participation, lower account balances, but even in that case, we find that overall retirement deficits for single females with 21 to 30 years of experience would still have a 21% reduction in retirement deficits. So we're going to continue to use the widow-widower dichotomy that we introduced here, the breakout, to do additional public policy analysis going forward. But the one thing I would request of the audience is if they have additional things they would like to see with this widow versus widower breakout, just please send me an email at vanderhei@ebri.org, and we will try our best to accommodate you. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
And Jack, we do have one question that's come in that might be good to address right now is where can people find this ARPA 2 proposal, which I guess has not yet been officially proposed, but has been floating around. Where would you recommend people go to find that?
Unfortunately, every copy I have received has been in a brown paper wrapper, so I don't think it's yet. I will, as soon as I find a website that this appears on, I can send that out. So just send me an email at vanderhei@avery.org, and I'll try and get it to you immediately.
Thanks, Jack. And we have been getting a few questions in addition that we will be addressing at the end of the session, but I just want to remind everyone to please, if you do have a question, just type it into the Q&A box and we will get to it at the end. And with that, I will turn it over to Anna.
Thank you very much, Lori, and I'm very pleased to be able to be with you and present the Society of Actuaries Analysis. And if we can have the agenda slide for the Society, thank you, of Actuaries Analysis.
Here I go again. I'm sorry, maybe I'm hard of hearing, but can you speak up? He sounded perfect when I asked him to.
I will do my best. I'm in a hand. I'm holding a handset, and I'll try to talk up. So thank you. I'm going to be talking about the Society of Actuaries research on post-retirement risk, some of the reality for women, some of our research on people 85 and over, a little bit about long-term care, and some practical ideas. There's more information also in the appendix in my slides, and all of the Society of Actuaries research is available on the Society of Actuaries website. And if you have trouble finding it, if you send an email, actually I'll send Lori an email so that they can distribute it to anybody who wants it to, but you can send me email as well. So we have the next slide, please. Next slide. The Society of Actuaries Committee on Post-Retirement Needs and Risk has been doing research relating to the post-retirement period for about 20 years. Our overall goal is to focus on the middle market, age 50 and over, and to try to understand and improve how people are managing risks. One of our big discoveries is that housing value is a large facet for many beyond Social Security. And Jack said to you what shortfalls were. We've discovered that many lack adequate assets and that decisions are needed to require trade-offs. We've looked at this from multiple points of view, but primarily the individual in surveys of how people perceive risk and how they manage it, and a variety of focus groups and in-depth interviews. And as I said, all those reports are out. We also did a generational survey in 2018. So while most of our work is on the 50 and older, we now have some by generation. We also have some consumer information. The women's work has been summarized in Understanding and Managing Post-Retirement Risks, Women in Post-Retirement Risk, which came out last year. That's a special report, and it references back to many of the prior reports. So let's go to the next slide. In listening to retirees, we find some themes from a series of focus groups and in-depth interviews. Women generally are more concerned about risks than men. We find this repeatedly, and it's partly due probably to them having more reality and being more wise about it, but also their circumstances are different. For many people, they aren't planning, or they have planning horizons that are way too short. And Jack's calculations go way, way out. But what we find is that people are planning often for a very short period of time and thinking about cash only. We find that people don't plan for unexpected things very often. So many people don't plan for unexpected things. So dealing with shocks requires adjustments or may be difficult. Retirees, however, have been shown to be resilient and willing to make adjustments, and many of the things that are not too severe, they adjust to very well. Older people, particularly those over age 85, often need help, and the family has proved to be a much bigger part of retirement security than is normally expected, and it's not really in the models, but it's in the reality of people's lives. And women, of course, are more likely to be the caregivers. So if we can move on to the next slide, the differences, and then the differences by gender. This tells us a little bit about the reality. Women live longer, and women living longer has lots of consequences. They're much more likely to be widowed. In the couples, when you say who in a couple is likely to survive longer, it's often the women, particularly since men marry younger wives, so sometimes it's a long time. Older women are more likely to be alone. There are career differences that mean women have lower earnings, and that leads to lower retirement savings and some of the numbers that Jack showed you. They also often take a bigger share of the family responsibility. Independent of that, they have higher long-term care costs, and I have some numbers. Many women have more focus on others, and if they're widowed later in life, then they're less likely to remarry. Okay. Now, next slide, please. This is an example of some of the retirement concerns by gender, and this comes from the risk survey, but this is in that summary report on women. This is picked up in that report as well. And we asked in each of the risk surveys, how concerned are you about each of the following during retirement? And these percentages are those that are very or somewhat concerned. We have males and females pre-retirees. Our survey results are pre-retirees and retirees. Males and female retirees. And the first thing is the value of your savings and investments might not go up with inflation, might not keep up with inflation. And this is a major area of concern in our surveys. It comes up every time in the top three. 71% of the male pre-retirees versus 83% of the females. For retirees, 52% of the men versus 62% of the women. That's the kind of differences that we find. The second row is you may not have enough money to pay for a long stay in a nursing home or a long period of nursing care. Similar difference, 68 versus 78 among the pre-retirees, 53 versus 65 among the retirees. So this is, we typically find this. Then the next slide, please. We did in the 2017 risk survey, each of these surveys has different areas of emphasis. We had an emphasis on housing and retirement. And there we asked people about which things would be important to them in choosing where they might live in retirement. And we found that there were, and the same kind of four columns that we had on the other side, we found that there were a number of things where there are significant differences by gender, and the top ones in the chart are examples of significant differences by gender. The bottom ones are examples where there are moderate differences by gender, and the things where there were significant differences by gender are like located in your family, located in your friends, a culture of mutual support where neighbors and friends help each other out, social opportunities, ability to get help. So a lot of the things that make a place to live in retirement good for some people, women seem much more interested in that than men, and that was true for both retirees and pre-retirees. There was much less difference on things like being near quality health care or hospitals, but that was very highly rated by both men and women. Much less difference on maintenance, and surprisingly lower no-home maintenance was still more important to women than men, and access to needed transportation. And there's a whole report about housing and retirement also available from the Society of Actuaries. The next slide. So there are risks that have a greater direct impact on women and some that have more indirect impact. The loss of a spouse, direct impact. Decline in functional status. Women have longer periods, and we have some data on that, of being partially major disabled later in life, and lower lifetime earnings and wealth. The next slide, please. As we think about longevity risk, one of the things that we found is that it's very hard to get people to understand longevity risk. And the Society of Actuaries has produced a series of 4 age-wise infographics that you can use with employees, with customers, with whatever, to help them understand some of the longevity issues. And this is one of them on longevity risk. You may live longer than you think, and the first block of that says that 1 out of 3 males, but 1 out of 2 females who are age 50 could live to be 90, and then it shows some of the different issues for couples. And the odds that a wife will outlive the husband, of course, are greater than vice versa. It's an example of that. The next slide, please. So some of the things that are the result of this longevity difference are that women are more likely to outlive their assets, and in a couple, the woman is likely to be the one that is a survivor, and that if they outlive assets, she's much more likely to be impacted. Healthcare risks increase with age and therefore have a greater risk for females, and inflation risk that changes over time, and the longer you are, it's bigger, so again, greater risk for women. The next slide. And this shows us inflation over time at 2 and 3%, and you can see impact is greater the longer out you go, and again, bigger impact for women. So if we can have the next slide, please. And this is from our research on people age 85 and over. The next slide, to look at the highlights here. The demographics of these people over age 85, the demographics are very different, a lot more women, and the women are much more likely to be widowed, and we have a little bit of data. From a financial security point of view, people have adjusted and managed, and those that haven't had major long-term care events, and this research, by the way, was not on wealthy people. These are people with less than $400,000 of assets. They've managed to make adjustments. They've reduced spending, and they've managed on less money than we would expect by being resilient and making adjustments. There's interesting data on spending and debt. There are a few that are in debt, not too many, but there's significant changes in spending over time. And while healthcare costs go up over time, other forms of spending tend to go down. Family is extremely important to this group, and one of the areas where we need to do more research is to understand how the people without the support of family manage and make up the difference, the things that family provides, which is usually not money, more than helping people, helping them with a variety of things. Living arrangements are quite different. I have some data on that, and relatively few, living arrangements change often. Relatively few are getting formal financial advice, and for employers, for many people, particularly when you're not in the wealthy group, the information they've gotten from employers may be the only outside unbiased advice that they're getting. I have 2 little bits of data to show you here. On the next slide, please. This is on marital status by age and gender. This is from that Society of Actuaries report, but the original data came from a Pew Foundation report. Marital status by age and gender among older Americans. And these are men 65 to 84 and 85 and over, women 65 to 85 and 85 and older. And of the men, the 65 to 84, 72% were married versus 51% of the 85 and over. But of the women, 48% in the first age group were married, compared to 13% in the later age group, the 85 and over. And the other big group are the widowed. Men, 10% at 65 to 84 versus 38% at 85 and over, and women, 30% versus 75%. So very big differences, partly based on longevity and partly based on the fact that the men are more likely to remarry. So if we move on to living arrangements, we've got here quite a bit of difference. We've got the same four. The columns are arranged differently. We have women 65 to 84 versus men 65 to 84, and women 85 and up, and men 85 and up. We have quite a lot of difference by gender. If we look at the 85 and up group, 13% of the women are in a nursing home or other group home versus 8% of the men. Unmarried and living with their own children, 23% of the women versus 10% of the men. Living with a spouse, only 12% of the women versus 49% of the men. And living alone, 46 versus 27%. And this again is from that Pew study. So there's lots of differences in what happens to women as they age. Now, if we can move on to the next slide in long-term care. Next slide. Women are much more likely than men to need long-term care. Very few people plan for it or think they will need it. People recognize that many people will need it, but they're more likely to be, well, it won't be me, which is the same thing as when you ask people about being above average. Everybody says they're above average. Family can be a huge source of help, and for many people that need moderate amounts of help, family is it. Husbands are much more likely than wives to have family caregivers and expect them. Women generally live longer and are more likely to need the caregivers. So I want to give you some data on life expectancy by health status. So the next slide. And here we have non-disabled, mild or moderately disabled, more severely disabled, men on top, women on the bottom, for ages 65, 75, 85, and 95. We'll just look at age 75. Men expect to have, at 75, 6.8 years on average of being non-disabled, 1.4 moderate disability, mild or moderate, 1.6 of more severe disability. Women, in contrast, almost the same non-disabled, about 7, but 2.6 and 3.0 years of mild or moderate or more severely disabled. And this is really a problem. And then the one other comment, next slide, is that for women versus men, long-term care premiums from this example, these are for at age 55, about 30% higher for single women than men, no surprise. And let's move on to quickly close with some practical ideas. So if we can go on to the next slide. Some of the things to do, next slide, are make sure that encourage people to have their legal affairs and papers in order. You want to encourage people to think longer term and plan how much retirement will cost. Many don't do that. They should review their retirement plan. If there's any divorce or family issues, they need to focus on that. Think about long-term care issues and Social Security claiming. Now, if we could, that makes a big difference. If we could skip that slide and go on to traps to avoid. Having too much debt is always a trap, and there are a few people that do, and that people that don't have debt under control and are nearing retirement, which are more than these days, that affects their entire retirement. Giving too much money to children, and this is a problem that women particularly may be vulnerable to. Quitting a job for caregiving. When somebody in the family needs help, women are frequently called on to help. It's a big strain. It's enormously expensive in the long term to people who quit a job, or even if they reduce schedules because they may not be able to get back to the same job, and they frequently don't look at the longer-term financial implications. So a lot of care is needed in thinking about that. Spending too much on housing can be a significant trap. Not understanding family finances and not having an emergency fund. Our work on all generations shows a significant number of people that don't have an emergency fund. Next slide, please. So we have here some personal tips for women. Be knowledgeable about families, household finances, including passwords. Make sure beneficiary designations are up to date. There are a number of situations that I've heard about where money ended up in the wrong person's hands because of a beneficiary designation not up to date. So it's a really important thing to remind employees, and this could be on an employer plan or life insurance. And there's an ERISA Advisory Council project on that if you want more information. Evaluate long-term care and Social Security claiming options. These are both really big decisions in the long term. Make sure credit cards and bank accounts are set up to give access for both members of the couple. Checking credit card rating is a good idea. Updating wills and legal documents and having proper powers of attorney, and putting together lists of financial information. The next slide has a list of some which I won't go over because I think we're ready for our question time. So thank you for providing this, and the appendix has a number of more Society of Actuaries reports and data in it.
Thank you, Anna. We do have a number of questions, and we'll get started on them. But if you do have additional questions, just type them into the Q&A box on your screen. Anna, I guess this question is something that could be addressed both between Anna and Jack. But Anna, how do you square the findings you seem to have about people being pretty satisfied in retirement, regardless of their situation? I mean, it just seems like there's a high level of satisfaction even when people don't have a lot of money. But how does that square with Jack's findings that, certain demographic groups, such as single women in particular, it's not that they're just not able to replace their income, but they're actually falling short of money they need to meet basic expenses. And so, how do you square the fact that these people may not have enough money even to meet basic expenses, according to the analysis?
Well, Lori, that's a great question, and it's a question that, as we've done these focus groups through the years and some of these in-depth interviews, we've been very interested in. And the traditional planning models look at people continuing to spend at about the same level or trying to spend at about the same level. The focus groups and the in-depth interviews, and of course we're talking about a fairly small number of people, and it's not data, show that people make adjustments, and many people are resilient, and certainly not all of them, but people are more satisfied than I think we would expect from these numbers, and that they're willing to make adjustments, they're resilient. If they run into a major problem, such as a major long-term care problem, that's going to be a significant problem. They may well end up going on Medicaid. I would encourage people to read some of these focus group reports because it's indeed fascinating, and I think it depends, of course, on the individual, but people are making a lot more adjustments than we would have expected. The other thing I would say is that Social Security makes a huge, huge difference, and people have been able to make adjustments when they have quite a bit of downscaling, but to get to Social Security. But if Social Security wasn't there, it would be an entirely different story. And then I would say the other thing is that families helping them makes a huge difference as well. And again, some of these in-depth interviews, the families really make a difference in doing things for people, in some of the people moving in with them, in adjusting. So the two big factors, I would say, Social Security and the families. I would think from a public policy point of view, it's also really important that Social Security doesn't get cut. And I know it looks like it, or that we look at what's going to happen with it, because that's really the lifeline for so many people. And if it was significantly less, I think you'd have a very different picture.
Lori, could I weigh in on this?
Please do.
Yeah, I agree with everything Anna said. I don't think our conclusions are that different, actually, because if you actually look at these families year by year in retirement, they really do seem fine in many cases until suddenly they don't. Without a doubt, the single biggest risk factor in terms of looking at a household that seems to have adequate retirement income at 65 who ends up running short of money is going to be some kind of catastrophic long-term care event. And if these people have been surveyed, prior to that event, I suspect that, as Anna said, they certainly are doing their best to make do. We have some additional analysis I could send whoever asked that question if they just want to email me that actually breaks this out by how many years in retirement, how many years after retirement one basically runs short of money, and except for the lowest income quartile, it's actually quite a substantial period of time in most cases. So depending on when you talk to these people, if they haven't already been institutionalized or the spouse hasn't already been institutionalized, it would not at all surprise me if most of them feel relatively confident at that point in time.
And one key difference between the two sets of analysis is that Anna's looking at people in retirement, and Jack, you're projecting people who are Gen X right now and heading towards retirement. And there's one key difference between those two constituents, and that's Gen X is much less likely to have pension income. And Anna talked about the importance of Social Security, but I would venture to guess that pension income is very important to the groups as well. So can either of you talk to that?
Well, I would be happy to send out a separate study we've done on that. We actually looked at the importance of defined benefit accruals in terms of this entire picture for Gen Xers. It'd be very hard to summarize quickly here, but I think on average you've got about depending whether it's final average or cash balance, I think you've got about a 15% improvement in overall retirement readiness rating if you have a defined benefit accrual. And that's collapsing them all into one category. We've got others that look at how many years you've got accruals for.
If you have people, and this is other work that I've done too with Vicki Badel-Schmidt, or that Vicki Badel-Schmidt's the main researcher on, if you have a significant pension accrual, be it DB or a significant amount in a DC plan, you're going to be substantially better off, and that's really important. I worry a lot about the future, and because of that I think fewer people are going to have that. Many people that don't have it are still managing, and that's why Social Security is so important. But pension for the employer is certainly extraordinarily important as well. But there are many people that don't have the kind of employment that gets them that, and that's a big concern as well.
And another question along the similar lines, thinking about the difference between current retirees and Gen X, is that Gen X appears like they might have fewer resources from families in terms of perhaps more likely to not have children or extended families. What is the research on that, Anna or Jack?
Well, from the Society of Actuaries' point of view, we've done not much yet, but I think it's one of the things we're going to be looking at going forward as people without family support. And I don't have much findings on that because we found family to be so important. But one of the other things about the research that you need to understand is we're talking about 85 and over people. A good part of our research has been working with adult children to hear about the families, because it's very hard to do research with 85 and over people. And of course, if you're doing it with adult children, you're missing out on the people that don't have any families.
Yeah, I would say in terms of EBRI research, this will sound like a lame excuse, but when we started building the model in the late 90s, the governors were very specific that they did not want intergenerational transfers modeled as part of this. So until very, very recently, we only looked at the household or the individual by themselves. We did have to expand on that after some testimony we gave for the Risk Advisory Council this summer, because we wanted to start looking at things like death benefits if one was going to purchase a QLAC. So we have now very painfully added that to the model and can start including that going forward, but we just haven't had an opportunity to look at that yet.
I want to make one more comment, too. One of the very troubling things that has shown up through the sequence of focus groups and interviews is that in the financial management, and this in a way goes back to the first question, is that a lot of people aren't planning forward for a lot of years, even retirees. They're looking at their current income, their current expenses on a cash flow basis, on a fairly short-term basis, and that's a big problem about planning and thinking about the future, and we found this in a lot of things. But the other half of that is that those people are trying to hold on to their assets and not spend them down. They become in effect a big emergency fund, and that's a paradigm that works unless you have that big long-term care event or something like that, or it can work. But Medicaid is really important. As Medicaid, we're going to stop paying for those big long-term care events, then the whole thing would be much, much more difficult.
Now, there was a comment earlier about just the age difference between men and women in couples tending to be younger, maybe contributing to the fact that women are more likely to end up alone in retirement. What are the other special issues when it comes to large gaps in ages between men and women in couples and retirement?
Well, I can talk a little bit in a way from personal experience too. I think one of the things is when you have a fairly large gap in age, things will seem to be fine, like it's not a big problem, till all of a sudden something happens, and then you realize how big the gap is and how many problems that, of course, means people will be widowed a lot longer, but also they may be caregiving at a pretty young age. There's a set of practical problems that actually we're discussing now in another Society of Actuaries problem around getting health insurance when one member of the couple is eligible for Medicare and one is not, or one is still employed and the other one is eligible for Medicare. There are a variety of situations and challenges. I can't run you through the details of them, but people may need expert help. That would be a good thing to give employees information about. Apparently, when you go to to Medicare or to the various people you'd ask questions to, and you have a couple like that, you don't always get good answers. You don't always know what to do. It can be quite messy.
This came up in the ASIC meeting as well, which is how does this apply when you consider minorities and the impact that of being in different minority groups might have on retirement outcomes. And I remember at the ASIC meeting there was a lot of talk about certain minorities really focusing on family over self, and they kind of being perceived as selfish to be saving a lot for your own retirement when your family had other needs. Jack or Anna, any relevant research focusing specifically on minorities?
The Society of Actuaries has not done anything focusing specifically on minorities. I think that the Women's Institute for a Secure Retirement might be a good resource on that, and I'm sure there are some different issues.
Yes, we've never included that as a variable in the simulation model on our end.
I think we've done some, haven't we done some in the past of evaluation of that in our retirement confidence survey?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's in the surveys, but as far as the simulation model itself, no, we don't have that kind of information on our 401k or IRA databases, so it'd be very hard to integrate that in.
Okay. Well, great. So, yeah, for those of you who want to look at the Retirement Confidence Survey, go to www.ebri.org, and it will have some just different survey analysis on that. We unfortunately are running low on time, and I did want to make a couple of announcements in terms of upcoming things. Our very next webinar will be on March 1st, and it will look at the revenue impact of the Cadillac tax, so please stay tuned for that, and we will be sending out announcements shortly on that. We already are planning for our policy forum on May 9th in Washington, D.C., and hopefully everyone here is subscribed to EBRI Insights, where we give details on that, and we are preparing to send out save the dates. And then our next April 30th meeting of American Savings Education Council partners will be right around the corner as well, and we will be featuring the Retirement Confidence Survey, which I mentioned. The most recent results will be coming out in April, and we will feature that in the upcoming ASIC meeting. And just wanted to thank everyone for joining us, and thank Jack Vanderhei and Anna Rappaport for sharing their insights